Welcome to today's day in history. Today is March 25th, 1961, and it's the day that Ivan Ivanovich is launched into space and returns to Earth. Now, Ivan Ivanovich, what an interesting story we have today. Now, the big idea is going to be, it's a good idea to run tests. And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. So, I'll let you write this down. Pause it if you want. Okay, let's see. We are in Perm, in the Ural Mountains. Now we're kind of, if you look at the map, we're kind of in Siberia, out in the cold. Now there's a lot of space over there, and this is where the Russians had planned to land their test flight. Okay. Now, hey, didn't we just talk about the space race? I think we did. Well, we're going to talk about it again because it's pretty important. And as you guys know, it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So the space race, which we did talk about, is when the U.S. and the USSR were competing with each other to see who could do as much as they could in space. They wanted to get people up there, test new technology, and it was a pretty big deal. It was what we would call a sense of national pride. If you could be the first to do this, it meant that your country, well, was the best at it, and that was another way to say that your system of government was the best. Because what we really had was not necessarily a race between the people in the United States and the people in Russia, but it was more a race to see whether democracy, or capitalistic democracy, and communism, which one is better? So this was a way for both countries to kind of compare their governments without actually comparing their governments. Kind of sounds like politics. Okay, so let's go to here. You remember Sputnik? Sputnik was quite a surprise, and we already talked about this, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But I did show you a new picture of Sputnik. It's not very big. It's like 2 feet. And all it really had inside was a radio. And for those of you that remember the day in history we did on Sputnik, it didn't have much technology in there. So, now, we're going to go to, who is it? Yep, it's Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. Okay, we talked about that a little bit last week. Did we do a day in history on it this year? I don't think we did, but we've talked about him at least 3 or 4 times. Okay, so now let's move on to Yuri's spacecraft. Now we talked a little bit about this the other day when we talked about the Vostok, was it 4? Which one was, which one had the first spacewalk? I can't remember. Tell me in the comments which Vostok it was. But the Vostok 1 was a very small spacecraft, and it worked really well. Now, they didn't just send it up with a human the first time, though. They ran some tests. And that's why today's big idea is it's a good idea to run tests. Now, if you look at this diagram, it's probably a little blurry on the picture, but the point I want you to see is that it's really complicated, okay? There's a lot of different things that have to work correctly so that Yuri, or whatever humans in there, can come back to space alive. Because if the astronaut died in space, or the cosmonaut in this case, it'd be a really, it would be really bad for that country to say, well, we tried, but we killed our cosmonaut. So they wanted to make sure it worked great. Okay, next slide. Now, this is the Sputnik 4. Now, this is the ship that they tested Ivan Ivanovich, Laika the dog, and also with this rocket. Now, they tested this rocket, and this is what the Sputnik was sent up on. This was the R7 ICBM, and it was really good at launching rockets. Now, when Sputnik went up, I think sometimes we think a lot about the satellite and not about the rocket it went up on. Because although America was really surprised, and the rest of the world was really surprised that the Russians got the first satellite up there, a lot of people were more concerned about the fact that they used a rocket to put it there. Because people recognized and realized that if you could put a satellite into space on a big rocket, you could also put a nuclear weapon. And that scared a lot of people. So the space race, although we focus a lot on the science and the exploration and the spaceships and the technology, a lot of it also has to do with the fear between the US and the USSR about all the nuclear weapons we had. And it really scared people at the time. Let's go to the next slide. Now, what I was going to tell you about the Sputnik 4 was that it took up Laika and this beautiful dog. I don't think we've talked about this dog. This dog's name was Chernushka. I think that's how you pronounce it. Which, if you translate it directly into Russian, I believe is translated into Blackie. So, Chernushka. Now, Chernushka flew with the first Ivan Ivanovich on Sputnik 4. Today's day in history is actually the second flight of Ivan Ivanovich on, well, today's date, March 25th. Okay, so here we go. Now, this is Ivan Ivanovich. Now, this is a really interesting part, because the Russians designed Ivan Ivanovich to resemble a human as closely as they could. Now, as you can see, there's compartments inside him, and they filled it with, well, some interesting things, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But first, I want to tell you what Ivan Ivanovich actually means. It actually means John Doe. Now, John Doe is what we give names, or is the name we give to people in America when we don't know their name. They're a John Doe or a Jane Doe. So Ivan Ivanovich is pretty much the same thing, just in Russian. Okay. Now, I think he looks a little creepy, maybe a little scary. And they designed him with eyebrows, eyeballs, like, he had hair, like, he was meant to look like a real human. They used, like, synthetic leather on his face. And what they really wanted to do, what the Russians wanted to do, was test what would happen to a human body in space. Now, we had no idea what would happen. I think now we take for granted that humans go up and we float around and it looks really cool. But back then, we had no idea what would happen. What if we went up and humans, like, our hearts didn't work because there was no gravity? What if we went up and something in our brain just turned off because the barosphere wasn't pulling down anymore? We didn't know. That's why we had to run a test. That's why the big idea is it's a good idea to run tests. All right, let's see what we got next. Now, what's interesting is they took Ivan Ivanovich and they put him in an ejection seat. An ejection seat is where, like, if you're in an airplane, if it starts to crash, you can hit a button and it shoots the pilot out. Well, they had that for the spacecraft as well, and it's actually the exact same system that Yuri Gagarin used when he went up and became the first human in space. Now, it worked really well. Ivan Ivanovich ejected from his spacecraft and floated down. Let's talk about what Ivan had in his body. Now, this is where it gets a little weird. It's weird, but I can also totally understand why they did it. Now, inside Ivan Ivanovich's body, they packed 40 white mice, 40 black mice, a bunch of guinea pigs, some reptiles, some human blood samples, some cancer cells, some bacteria, and fermentation samples. Now, they put all of this stuff in there so that when it came back down, they could run tests on it to see what space did to living things. Yeah. And they must have found out that it was okay because they shortly after sent Yuri Gagarin up. Okay. Now, this is kind of a cool picture of what the ejection seat did. It shot him out. Ivan Ivanovich floated down with his parachute, and he ended up having the same exact flight plan as Yuri Gagarin. So this was really a exact test of what would happen for the first human in space. Now, here's the funny part of the story. I mean, I kind of think that it's funny that they put a bunch of animals and stuff inside Ivan Ivanovich. But apparently, when Ivan Ivanovich landed, he parachuted out way out in the Ural Mountains, And some of the people that worked for the Russian Space Agency decided to get some local villagers, some people that lived around there, to help find him, because the Ural Mountains is pretty big and it was snowy and they needed some help. And so they probably didn't give these villagers all the information, because they had them all go out and look, and these villagers finally found Ivan Ivanovich, and he was crumpled in the snow. And they ran up, and when they realized that Ivan Ivanovich was a test dummy and not a real person, apparently they got a little upset that they had to rush out into the woods to find this guy. So instead of cheering that we had a very successful test of an ejection system, a rocket launch up into space, all this stuff, they instead punched Ivan Ivanovich in the face. Yes, the test dummy was punched in the face. I don't know, that's the story I read. So, he was found, and he was a success. Now, the Ural Mountains, nice place, and it's also the place where the test that made it possible for the first human to go into space took place. Thanks.